Hi guys, and welcome to the TruGolf Academy. You've joined me, Jon Watts, today at Drayton Park Golf Club. I'm in my swing studio and today is a follow-up video. It's a two-parter, and this is talking about the wrist cock, the wrist hinge. So it was a question I got following a previous video I had done on actually a completely different subject. But the question was quite a detailed one, and it was talking about when do I cock the wrist, when do I hinge the wrist, when do I uncock the wrist, when do I re-hinge the wrist. So what I've talked about so far is the differences between wrist cock and wrist hinge. And we talked about my preference in the backswing or what I'd like to see. So as a real quick recap on that, wrist cock is this movement up and down, okay? And wrist hinge is this movement from side to side. If you think about a door opening, door closing, that's more of a hinging movement. Cocking movement is if you're pulling the gun back, so it's a cocking up and down movement. So my preference in the backswing was to try and get the wrist cocking a little bit sooner in the first half of the swing to create this 90-degree angle between my lead arm and the club shaft. As long as it happens at some point in the backswing, then it's fine, but the later it's happening, the quicker things are happening, the more we're getting in the way of the transition. It's easier if the wrist cock is happening a little sooner. And my other worry with it happening late is I find a lot of golfers trying to go so wide that they end up with a very late wrist cock or very little wrist cock, but because they're trying to get so much width, and we end up quite often seeing this lateral movement off the ball. So my preference is a slightly earlier wrist cock in the backswing so we can maintain it to the top. Now in terms of the hinging movement, so that is this movement. There has to be some hinging movement, of course there does, but it's really controlled by the big muscles. So it's my chest turning away from the target. There is some wrist hinge, but in this first movement to first parallel, I don't quite want to see 90 degrees of wrist hinge, which would get the club face straight up, the toes straight up. I actually want the club to be more at the angle of my spine. So I want to see some wrist hinge in there definitely, but the big part in the backswing is allowing these wrists to cock a little bit sooner. I still believe if you get a good grip and a good grip pressure and you're using the big muscles in the golf swing, we don't have to think about our wrists so much. When golfers get a very high palmy grip or a very weak grip, or they're gripping it too tight, they will struggle to really get this movement correct. So do look at grip pressure to start to affect what the wrists are doing in the backswing and the downswing. This part I wanted to go more on from, okay, we're at the top of the backswing, what are the wrists doing in the downswing? Mainly, what point do we uncock our wrists or unhinge our wrists, and what point do we rehinge on the way through? Because that was the second part of the question that I received. So what I like to see, as I said, is this wrist cock a little bit earlier in the backswing, maintained to the top. You can still see that gives me this 90-degree angle between my lead arm and the club shaft. Now we want to maintain that as long as we can. What we see with the better golfers is they get to this position where the hands are pretty much over the golf ball and they've still near enough got a 90-degree angle. We have to release that at some point, otherwise we're not going to get the club to the ground, to the bottom of the golf ball, and we're going to be losing speed. So there has to be a point where we release that wrist cock, and we want it to be nearer the golf ball. So we want maximum speed here. What a lot of golfers are getting is they're releasing this wrist cock far too early on their downswing. Now that might have come from a number of reasons. That could have been the backswing was too long, the arm started collapsing. That may be that their downswing is out of sequence and dominated by the upper body. So I guess I can't give you a one answer for everybody, but if you are this way, you will tend to lose that angle much sooner, just to stop the club crashing into the ground early. But my preference would be to hold this angle until our hands are nearer over the top of the golf ball, and we need to release that at some point. And this is a really good exercise actually. Just come down holding the club shaft with your trail hand, get your hands over the top of the golf ball, and feel like you allow that club then just to work downwards into the ground, into the back of the golf ball here. My hands actually reach their lowest point pre-impact. They're not still moving downwards. So at this point, my hands are actually moving up and a little bit more left, but the club is still on a downward path. Okay, and that's the bit that confuses some golfers. We're not still getting our arms moving down. They reach their lowest point at last parallel, and we're actually moving up and left for a right-handed golfer as we release that angle. And so I need you to release that angle to make sure you generate some speed here. At what point do your wrists recock? Well, it doesn't matter so much. You will tend to see there's a little bit more extension with most golfers here, so the wrist cock may be a little bit later in the follow through, but that does depend on the width. I do like to see a wide movement through the ball, so I don't mind seeing the wrist start to recock a little bit later, but the reality is the ball's been and gone, so it doesn't matter so much. You'll see a variance in terms of follow through movements, but as long as here was good, I'm not particularly worried. So that's wrist cock. Wrist hinge, remember that's this movement, opening and closing the door. My preference is actually for players to rely on less wrist hinge into impact. So we can generate speed, I've talked about this before in other videos, we can generate speed this way, but it's very hard to control the club face because it's opening and closing or closing down very quickly into impact. So what I prefer to see is actually more body rotation. To allow that, we need to get the wrist working correctly in the downswing. So what we see with the majority of elite golfers is their lead wrist moves a little bit more into flexion on the downswing as the club starts to shallow. And that just means the glove logo is pointing away from the target. The wrist starts to turn away from target. That allows the club to shallow but closes the club face. So from this position, I don't need as much wrist hinge. I can actually create more rotation to try and square the club face. If that club face gets wide open on the downswing, then it's going to take a lot of rotation and a lot of wrist hinge to try and square that club face. So I guess there is no set amount, but what you'll see with a player perhaps more like a Dustin Johnson, who gets more of a closed club face in the top of the backswing, he maintains that angle. It's not going closed to open, it's just being held off. So there is a lot less wrist hinge through impact. We need enough so we get the club face back to square, but I would always try and involve the big muscles, the body, and I wouldn't actually be focusing so much on the wrists. If you were someone who is struggling with an open club face, hitting pushes, slices, fades, then you could try and get more wrist hinge through the ball, and that would have an effect of closing the club face, but it's very hard to do consistently. So what I'm really looking for is just to get the club in a better position where we don't need as much wrist hinge here at the golf ball through impact. So I hope that sort of answered your question. As I said, there's no wrong or right for, you couldn't say, of course I've got a model swing in my head, I think every coach does, but we've got to teach the golfer in front of us, whether that club face is too open, too closed, we may change what we're talking about and what we're looking for. But in terms of the wrist cock, if we can cock the wrists a little bit sooner and hold that angle until nearer impact, we can start to generate maximum speed, velocity nearer the golf ball, which is what we really want to see. I'm less worried about which point they start to recock on the way through. And in terms of the hinging movement, it depends on how much we have to close the club face. If we can get the club face a little closed earlier through our shallowing movement and our lead wrist, then we actually don't need as much hand and arm action through impact. We can create more body rotation, which is a much more consistent way to do it. Let me just finish by hitting a quick shot and just try and demonstrate what I'm talking about there. So if I get a good grip more through my fingers, good grip pressure, not squeezing it too tight, I should be able to start to get my wrist to cock a little bit sooner, which would be my preference rather than trying to go so wide. I'm trying to maintain that angle on the downswing, losing it more into impact here. And if I can get Not that I'm thinking of all this, but if the club face is closing earlier, I'd need less wrist hinge here through impact. So it's more of a body movement instead of hands. That looks pretty good to me. That felt pretty solid. I would never suggest thinking of, a great deal when we're out and about on the golf course. I actually got some nice minimal numbers there. A little bit more down on it than I like to see. It's something I work quite hard on, but you can see my club face and path were very minimal for just a slight soft draw. So pretty good figures all in all. But I hope those two videos help talking about first the difference from wrist cock to wrist hinge, and at what times we're trying to get these to cock and uncock in the backswing, the downswing, and of course post impact. If you do have any questions, post them below. Do get in touch on all our social media platforms as well. It's a great way to ask what videos you would like to see, any subjects you're struggling with, and I can get round to filming those. Thanks guys, we'll see you soon.